The U.S. is determined to defend democracy, the greatest instrument of mankind, working with G7 countries to deliver that for the rest of the world. Rules-based order is being attacked. I was waiting for him to say China there, but he didn't say it. But I'm guessing that that may be the case. Let's bring in Don DeBar, activist and commentator. Maybe he can tell us. Don DeBar, welcome. So Biden started out with Russia and the war and attacked Russia. 20 sentences I have. Tell us about his opening statements there, how he came off on that issue.
Well, belligerent. It's obvious that whoever's writing his material, it's almost like Saturday Night Live, but whoever is writing his material is writing a war speech. You have to look at this in the context of what's been happening over the past few days, particularly a speech given yesterday by President Putin, taking stock of what's been happening, not just in Ukraine, but around Ukraine, reminding people what led up to the situation in Ukraine, the United States funding, organizing a coup d'etat against the elected president that began in earnest in 2013. This is after the expense of $5 billion by the United States and by U.S. taxpayers to build the communications infrastructure, TV stations and radio stations, et cetera, that were used to demonize the government, to demonize the Russian ethnics in the eastern part of the country, and to organize basically a mob to seize power in February of 2014. From then, the government installed by the United States, by that device, declared war on the people in the eastern part of the country and announced its intentions to try to reacquire nuclear weapons, which had been surrendered at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. This comes in the context of the NATOization of Eastern Europe and of some of these former Soviet republics, particularly the Baltics, and some of the members of the Warsaw Pact, in fact, all of the members of the Warsaw Pact, right up to Russia's borders. The introduction of actual Nazi rituals, insignia, and rhetoric in Ukraine after the, up to and including the seizure of power in February of 2014 was essentially too much. And yet, it took Russia 8 years to finally act. We're talking about a history that back from 1939 to 1945 resulted in the murder of more than 27 million people in the Soviet Union, mostly Russians, by Nazis, including collaboration with people who are now being held up as heroes of Ukraine. So that's the context for the Russian aggression, quote unquote, that Biden speaks of. One last point, of course, is that the war is taking place on Russia's borders, not in Mexico's border with the United States or Canada's border with the United States, where there's not a single Russian rifle deployed, but rather most of the military of NATO, including the active U.S. and the Western sphere, is now sit at Russia's border. So it's pretty easy looking at a map to know who the aggressor is. The rest of this noise, I don't understand exactly what the purpose of it is. No one in the United Nations has any illusions about any of this, whether it's the U.S. puppets that support what the United States is doing because they're told to, or the bulk of the rest of the world, about 2/3 of humanity, that knows exactly who the aggressor is, and they know exactly what their stake is in the outcome of this, because the U.S. either has designs on them, like it has on Russia's resources, or it already has their hands in their pot, and these people are trying to get free of it.
Moving on to what he said about the rules-based order is being attacked. This was after he was talking about Russia, but that particular wording about rules-based order and even it being attacked was something that I think Anthony Blinken talked about maybe a little over a month ago when he was in China, or about China, but he didn't mention China. Do you think he meant China?
Well, this is sort of like political Tourette's with the U.S., with the exceptionalists out of Washington, D.C. The rules-based order is essentially their rules or orders for the rest of the world. you know, if you're looking at rules, let's look to the United Nations Charter, for example, and let's look to the general body of international law, as fragmented and, you know, as it may be. Um, Sponsoring a coup d'etat is illegal. My understanding, for example, of the state of law in Germany is that having anything to do with Nazi symbolism, particularly supporting actual Nazis in a war against Russia, is illegal. The United States is sponsoring that. There are so many things that are going on. U.S. invading Iraq was illegal. Invading Afghanistan was illegal. The continuing occupation of Iraq is illegal. The war in Yemen is illegal. The occupation of Palestine is illegal. The war going on in Congo is illegal. I could go on and on. So when they say rules-based order, it's very difficult to parse exactly what they mean because it has no bearing, no relation to the reality of U.S. policy around the world.
The mention of the veto was interesting, that he felt that that should be something that we need to only use under extreme circumstances. And at the same time, he talked about how other countries should be brought on board, and he mentioned the Caribbean, Latin America, and African countries. Why do you think he mentioned that or deemed it to be important to bring it up?
Well, it's called mischief making and self-serving. On the one hand, you know, the architecture of the United Nations is a relic of the Second World War, and that has had only really one adjustment of any consequence, which was in the early 70s when the United States finally recognized the 1949 Chinese Revolution and allowed, along with its other cohorts on the Security Council, the actual Chinese government to occupy China's seat. In World War II, China and the Soviet Union lost by far the most people. China lost also to Japan, some 30 million people. And so at the end of World War II, at the construct, at the dawn of the United Nations, these losses were recognized pretty much by everyone because they were inescapable. And so in order to keep the peace going forward, you had a General Assembly where each country, regardless of size, would have one vote, so you could get a general sense of the world's governments by resolutions that passed through the General Assembly. And then there would be a Security Council that's responsible basically for keeping the peace, and that only actions approved by the Security Council could be taken, you know, of a military nature, absent immediate self-defense necessities. In other words, if you're being invaded, not about to be invaded, but actually being invaded. Mm-hmm. In order to prevent a ganging up from happening on the Security Council, each of the 5 powers that were recognized as the victors in World War II, the United States, the Soviet Union, and then Britain, France, and China, were given the power to veto any action that was going to be taken by the Security Council. In other words, you could not take a war without the approval of all 5 of these, at least tacit approval. If one of them said no, then you could not take action, and theoretically no war would take place. Apparently, the United States does not find this convenient anymore because Russia and China have begun vetoing U.S. adventures after seeing what happened in Libya. They vetoed it in Syria, and they vetoed it several times in other places since the destruction of Libya in 2011.